with a bit of an overview of some recent trends in terms of distributed solar utilization in Virginia. I'm also going to then talk about some of the criticisms of distributed solar and try to pick those apart, and those criticisms being with respect to costs and the perceived impacts of distributed solar on the electric utilities and consumers. And I'm also going to talk at the end about sort of the relationship, the relevance of local planning and permitting, and how that can be utilized to better support distributed solar's growth. And so we've heard a lot today about how solar is booming in Virginia, which is certainly true in some ways, but I'm going to throw a little bit of cold water on that, because when we talk about distributed solar, it certainly is growing quite fast on a percentage basis, and my chart on the right there is similar to a chart that Ken from DMME showed earlier this morning. And so we're up to about probably 50 megawatts of distributed solar currently statewide, but we're lagging really far behind other states. And so we're 31st in the country in total distributed solar capacity. And if you compare us to neighboring states like North Carolina and Maryland, they're up in the several hundreds of megawatts of distributed solar capacity. And we actually only recently, in 2017, passed the District of Columbia. So as of 2016, there was more distributed solar in Washington, D.C. than there was in the entire state of Virginia. So if you look at that on a per capita basis, we're 38th in the country. And another way of looking at it that I think is pretty interesting is looking at the percentage of all of our solar capacity that comes from distributed resources. That's only 11%, which puts us 45th in the country. So 44 states have a higher percentage of their total solar coming from distributed sources. Another point that I'd like to make in terms of framing where we are in distributed and how that's being approached in this state, we've heard a lot of talk today about the Grid Transformation Act and how that declares certain amounts of solar energy to be in the public interest, including distributed solar. But the act is written in a way that specifically excludes systems of 50 kilowatts or smaller from being in the public interest. So distributed solar, the likes of which Tony and some of my companies are building, and what I would call sort of mid-scale solar, is considered in the public interest, but distributed solar on rooftops for homes and small businesses and so forth is not, according to that legislation. So I think that that's an interesting point that kind of puts things in perspective in terms of how distributed solar is being approached in the state as opposed to some of the larger scale systems. So I know I'm going to put this back. So one of the major policy issues with respect to distributed solar, and again, as I've talked about distributed solar, I'm really talking about the smaller scale types of systems that are in that, that are net metered. And that can be larger than 50 kilowatts, but often we're thinking of those in terms of the smaller systems that, as I said, are currently not considered in the public interest. And this table here is looking at one of the primary issues in policy with respect to distributed solar, which is this 1% cap. So state law prohibits the installation of distributed solar within a given utility service area. That total capacity of distributed solar cannot exceed 1% of the peak load for that utility. And I know that this table is a little bit hard to read, but what we're showing here is that statewide, we're at about roughly 0.1% of peak load coming from distributed solar, and that's also roughly where Dominion and Appalachian Power are. And this is all according to, again, the slightly dated information from U.S. Energy Information Administration. But if we look on the bottom part of this chart in the far right column, we can see that some of the electric co-ops are actually getting somewhat close to that peak. A couple, we have Rappahannock and Shenandoah Valley that are both over a third of the way to the peak, and we have Craig Botetourt, which is more than halfway already. And that Craig Botetourt is also an interesting case because when we think about these percentages with respect to peak loads, in some of these co-ops, the peak loads are very small, right? These co-op utilities are much, much smaller than Dominion. Craig Botetourt's peak load is 25 megawatts. So considering that they're already halfway there, they're only 110 kilowatts away from hitting that peak. So we're talking about potentially, 2 medium-sized arrays, the likes of which Tony's group would put up, that would, or maybe even just one, would put them above that limit, and would thus be, prohibited. Where did I put this thing? So quite a few studies have been done recently to look at the potential capacity of distributed solar, and I'm going to talk about those studies in terms of 3 different types of studies. The first of which looks at the market potential, and the most famous, I guess you would say, market potential study on solar was done by the US Department of Energy in 2012, and they didn't quite specifically identify distributed solar potential in Virginia, but as you can see here, they found the total potential for all solar in Virginia to be 8,700 megawatts by 2030 and over 21 gigawatts by 2050. Looking at the national scale, they found that solar could provide basically between 3.5% to 6%, distributed solar could provide 3.5% to 6% of our total electricity demand by 2050, and that would result in significant downward pressure on prices, which I think is important. Some other studies have looked at the potential for distributed solar in terms of actual rooftop capacity. How much can we put on our rooftops? The National Renewable Energy Laboratory has done a lot of research on this. One study in 2008 found that about 25% of total residential rooftop space and 60% of commercial rooftop space is solar ready, in the sense of having good solar access, not being shaded, having sufficient roof structure and so forth. In 2016, NREL study found that in Virginia, the total rooftop capacity is over 28 gigawatts. Which could provide a third of the state's electricity generation. Now, there's a wide range of findings on this topic, because another study done for the PJM area found that our rooftop potential in Virginia is only 3,160 megawatts, but that is still vastly more than the 50 megawatts that we have now, and framing that in terms of that peak load penetration, that would be roughly about 6%. In terms, we have this 1% cap now, and this conservative estimate of our rooftop potential would be about 6%. And so some of the resistance to distributed PV, particularly when we talk about net meter distributed solar, has been based on these 2 arguments about some of the problems that it could cause. One of which being that it imposes costs on the utilities that must be passed on to the consumers, and thus is what we call cross-subsidization, the idea that non-solar owning consumers would be paying more to to cover the costs imposed by solar owning consumers. Now, this is something that certainly could potentially be true, and certainly would be true at some point if distributed solar market penetration reached much, much higher levels. But there's no evidence to demonstrate that that's actually the case today or in the foreseeable future here in Virginia. There's been no study, first and foremost, to pull apart the data to actually look into the costs and benefits of solar in Virginia. No comprehensive study similar to the studies that have been done in many other states. And many of those other states do show that distributed solar's costs, or net benefits, I guess you would say, to utilities, more or less add out to being cost neutral or actually providing a positive benefit to the utilities. So rather than in theory there being costs that would have to be passed on to consumers, there might actually be net benefits. Again, we don't know what the case would be in Virginia. We haven't done that research. The closest thing that we have done to that research was a study done by the State Corporation Commission in 2011, which took a very sort of narrow definition of what the benefits of distributed solar are to utilities and quantified that value accordingly. And so found that there were net costs per kilowatt hour, but when you think about the very small magnitude of distributed solar that we have currently, those net costs don't add up to very much. And when we think about the scale of the electricity market. And so one of the, I think, particularly illuminating findings from that 2011 study was that, again, based on this conservative, sort of narrow, you might say, definition of what the benefits of distributed solar are to utilities, the State Corporation Commission found that if we increased our net metered distributed solar capacity all the way up to that 1% cap, the costs that they estimated would only add up to increasing the average residential consumer's bill by $6.73 per year. Okay, and so that's, again, the conservative estimate of what these, or it's a conservative estimate of the benefits and therefore a somewhat extreme estimate of the costs. Now, another type of criticism that is related to the cost is specifically costs that would be incurred based on technical impacts to the distribution grid. And there's been a lot of research on this issue, which is all extremely complicated and engineering heavy, and there's not a real consensus because the grid conditions can vary quite a bit depending on in different types of areas, and certainly the electric co-ops that are serving rural areas have a much bigger challenge when it comes to the potential impacts of distributed solar. Okay, but a lot of research has been done to indicate that we could certainly handle up to, the rough consensus of this research is that up to about 5% distributed solar, generally speaking, could be supported by distribution grids, although again, in certain cases that would, the total would be less. A study was done by Navigant for Dominion that also demonstrated large potential for supporting distributed solar on their distribution grids without technical problems, but again, in certain cases, those technical problems would be present much more quickly. So another sort of related to this idea of the distribution grid impacts, one of the ways of minimizing those distribution grid impacts is by concentrating on the commercial sector. Because commercial sector buildings, their demand peaks in the afternoons, as you can see here in examples for office buildings, grocery stores, and retail stores. The demand for power in those buildings peaks at around the same time that solar energy production is peaking. So solar systems that are on those buildings are going to offload less electricity to the grid because more of it's going to be produced at the time that the building needs it. So to close with a few ways in which this relates to planning, one of the, certainly one of the ways that local permitting authorities can help to support distributed solar is by easing zoning restrictions. And these are, often there are zoning restrictions that are not necessarily purposeful, but are just reflections of the fact that rooftop solar is a relatively new phenomenon and many localities don't have haven't really accounted for it, so to speak, in their permitting regulations. And so a couple of examples of problems that can arise occur with setback restrictions and height limits. And in the city of Richmond, actually, we just, within the past year, identified a problem where attached buildings, row houses, of which there are over 8,000 just in the city of Richmond, were being interpreted to where rooftop solar panels on attached buildings had to have a 3-foot setback from the neighboring building. So that was a major constraint on the area that was available to put distributed solar on rooftops for those attached houses. And the City Office of Sustainability as well and the City Planning Department, both of which are represented here today, got together and worked on this issue and figured out a way to reinterpret the existing zoning code in order to eliminate that setback restriction in most cases for attached buildings. Another area of potential collaboration and role for localities and for planning is with respect to mapping. So I've done a little bit of research looking into using GIS tools to evaluate solar energy capacity and looking into how that can be paired with how localities or how planners can work with utilities to not just identify the capacity for where panels can be located, but also figuring out how to identify locations where they're going to provide the most benefits to the grid and avoid those situations where distributed solar could actually be negatively impactful to the distribution grid. And finally, in terms of the local role, creating incentives for distributed solar would certainly be ideal, and particularly if those could be targeted towards the commercial sector, which again, as I said before, is the situation where these potential grid impacts are least concerning. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Damian. I want to be respectful of the schedule, but if we have a few questions for Damian or any of the panelists, we can certainly get into these issues. There's any number of directions we can head in here. David.
Hey David, thanks for your presentation, David Murray, DVC. I had a question, given that we've talked a lot about grid modernization, if you could speak to how advanced metering infrastructure and smart inverters will play into supporting or advancing distributed generation across Virginia.
Yeah, thank you. And so that's something that, the longer version of this talk, I get into how, while certainly I don't agree with the criticisms that net metering is a problem now, I do see how in the future there is a better way to do this that could support not only distributed solar, but also things like storage and other distributed energy resources. And that would involve compensating individual solar owners at a higher rate for when their power is released at peak times to try to, so part of the problem with net metering is that it treats electricity as a commodity that has a fixed value at all times, which is not really the case in the market, right? So if we had what I call a post-net metering model that is being explored in some other states, we could have distributed solar owners being compensated for power that they release at peak times at a higher rate than power that's released at areas of low demand. And that would require storage on site, and that would require advanced metering infrastructure to make all that work. So I think that there are certainly some of the things that the Grid Modernization Act is trying to do, I think are extremely important in terms of putting in that infrastructure and the technology to allow not just solar, but a variety of distributed energy resources to work together. So yeah, that's my answer.
Might be interesting to hear, are there localities here today that are exploring either, or any of these scenarios where you're seeing not only maybe the utility scale projects come in and want to have a permit run through the permit by rule process looking for local approval before they can head to the state, but one of the topics that none of these folks really dealt with in specificity was the idea of an ag generator. There's a sort of a classification here for net metered projects that occur on farm, recouping the cost of energy used on farm. I'd be curious to know if anyone is dealing with that, if localities are experiencing some interaction with Rooftop, whether it's commercial, nonprofit, or personal use scale as well. We're going to talk a lot about utility scale stuff, so I want to make sure we're being inclusive here. Crystal.
Hi, I'm Crystal Rittervold. I'm Sustainability Manager for City of Charlottesville, and I just thought there may be some localities here who would be interested. We recently did some updates to our zoning code to address specifically the lack of reference of solar in our code, and that may be a good model for some folks to look at. We've recently finished work with a company to do the mapping of solar potential, and that's hopefully going to go live in the next couple months. So again, the idea is to make it accessible and obvious that there's a lot of potential in the community. And then we have a commercial energy loan fund, a program that actually helps buy down the interest rate on the financing for solar programs, and it's targeted to the commercial side. So those are some interesting things. And in general, the city has not experienced some of the challenges that larger counties, et cetera, are having because we're all built out, but we're certainly trying to maximize solar generation on site.
Another thing I would like to say about the permitting issues is that currently we're looking at distributed solar energy systems as a use, right? Is it allowed use? Is it an accessory use? What kind of a use is it? But a point that one of the local installers in Richmond made when we were having these discussions with the city of Richmond was as the solar technology evolves and we start to get into more building integrated types of solar generation, rooftop shingles and so forth, how do you define that? Because that's clearly not an accessory use. That's truly part of the building, which I think some of the solar installers would argue is how we should consider distributed solar now, to be part of the building, part of the roof essentially. And another, we mentioned storage a few times recently, that's going to become an increasingly large permitting issue as well down the road, and I would encourage you all to try to get ahead of the curve on that one.
I just have a couple of follow-ups. You asked about agricultural installations. I just want to make sure everybody's aware that we do have an agricultural net metering program set up in Virginia. So there is current public policy and law available for farms who want to install renewables and net meter with their utility. A couple just responses to the presentations. I want to make sure people know that while Dominion is certainly building a lot of utility scale solar, we are not opposed or in any way against distributed generation. We've worked with colleges, universities, schools, and others, counties, localities to do distributed generation. So please don't think that we're not an alternative when it comes to distributed generation. We very much want to work with folks on smaller rooftop projects. The other thing is that a lot's come up about the machinery and tools tax and other taxes and tax benefits for localities. There is no way we're going to build 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, much less 5,000 megawatts of solar in the Commonwealth without local community support. And I just say to those folks that are here from the counties and the cities, you're in charge. People cannot build projects in your localities without the permits that they need. So ask those hard questions about tax and tax benefits. Figure out how you benefit property tax-wise. Figure out how the machinery and tools tax is going to affect you. Figure out what else can be done for you. Make sure your erosion and sediment control regulations are strong. We want to be in communities that like us. We're a good neighbor. The other solar developers here want to be a good neighbor. So help us understand what being a good neighbor is, and we'll get to our goals.
I want to echo Lisa's comment that Dominion has come a long way in supporting distributed solar, and we're so glad for that. And I think there's much more room to go. I think the next barrier, really at a high policy level, is what kind of choices do we want for consumers going forward? We have the North Carolina model, which is 95% utility-owned solar. We have the Pennsylvania model, which is 50% utility solar, 50% consumer-owned solar. What kind of future do we want in Virginia? And that is largely driven by policy. And I would suggest that it's time for us very soon to revisit the business model that we expect and want from the utility companies. So we reward the utility companies for investing in customer-owned solar. Wouldn't that be a concept? Now, that changes the business model for Dominion, creates uncertainty for them. They're very good at what they do, a lot of smart people in that company. And there's resistance to change of the business model. It's a very significant change, but from a public policy standpoint, let's think of more creatively in Virginia, and not only for the utility business model, but how do we encourage more solar plus storage, because that's really going to be the game changer going forward.
Well, we're going to go into a break here for a little bit, give you guys a chance to stretch your legs, think about what's been talked about so far. And when we come back, we're going to get into the regulatory structure in some great detail. We have, I believe, Mary Beth Major is going to be talking to us, as well as Patrick from the Rappahannock Mutual Commission. They're going to get into the permit by rule, how local authority actually gets experience. That being said, I have enormous amount of questions about the complexity. We talked about, I think Tony had mentioned the word balkanization of the policy landscape. We have nonprofit regulations that differ from individual rooftop owners, and then again from the utility scale stuff. So I do want to dig into that a little bit. The permit by rule process that we're going to be getting into really is focusing on any project that's sort of over 5 megawatts. So it's a project that's going to be land-based, ground-mounted, and taking up a fair amount of space adjacent to buildings if they are near buildings. That being said, is it necessary for us to have nonprofit carve-outs? Are there net metering programs that can be experienced in the rural landscape in the same way they're experienced in the urban landscape? Is it necessary to have so many fragmentation? And what does that fragmentation mean for local permitting and siting, taxation, and all the rest? Some of those questions really can only be answered by the people in the room from localities informing public policy discussions.